It's a pleasure to introduce Professor Brooke Holmes, who's Professor of Classics at Princeton University and affiliated with a wide range of other centers there spanning gender, sexuality, science, humanities, criticism, which gives you some sense of the multi- and interdisciplinary nature of her work. She works at the intersections of Greek literature, science, medicine, and philosophy, with particular interest in the history of subjectivity, materiality, and the body. Her first book, The Symptom and the Subject, The Emergence of the Body in Ancient Greece, was published in 2010, and followed by another book, Gender, Antiquity, and Its Legacy, in 2012. She's currently working on the concept of sympathy in Hellenistic and Roman science, medicine, and philosophy, and I think the connections between her paper and what we've just been hearing about are very resonant. So we move from the sharing of life to the sympathetic cosmos.
So here is the caption for our age. Everything is connected. Because postmodernity is a rhetoric of fragmentation, because the temporality of our lives is atomized by instant messaging and instant gratification, we reach first for the utopian valences, whether techno-social or ecological. Connectivity is social media in the Arab Spring. It's 1,000 variants on the Gaia hypothesis. Then at a lag, the phrase everything is connected turns dystopian. This is Citizen4 and the NSA. This is the fallout from Chernobyl or the factory farm upstream. Both sides of the coin, utopian and dystopian, bear the imprint of the posthuman. But the complexities and the seductions of organic connectivity on a global scale are ancient. They cluster most visibly around the concept of cosmic sympathy. Now, ancient sympathy holds innate appeal in these fractured times when thinking our way into a concept of community that can encompass human and non-human alike has become imperative. And in fact, there have been signs of a rising interest in sympathy across a range of disciplines, from political theory to literary studies, from anthropology to philosophy. So let me make clear then from the outset that my aim here is not to recuperate sympathy as a long-lost mode of thought to be embraced as an antidote to the disenchantment and the dismemberment of our modern lives. I do believe that the exercise of trying to inhabit the conceptual space of ancient sympathy holds considerable promise for imagining communities beyond the human. But my primary aim today will be to probe the constitutive tensions of sympathy as a way into thinking about the constitutive tensions within organistic thinking more generally. I see such labor as integral to a conversation about the stakes and the ambitions of what is sometimes called a neo-vitalist politics, or even more broadly, the politics, philosophy, and rhetoric of life. This work also bears on the larger question or problem of the very concept of what I would call capital N nature. At a moment when that concept has come under critique in the crucible of ecological crisis, it's useful to try to better understand how and why nature became so entrenched within the Western tradition. Tracking sympathy, I suggest, is part of this genealogical labor. The genealogical aspect of the work is why going back to classical antiquity is very different than pursuing what the anthropologist Philippe Descola calls the ecology of others, the ecology, that is, of non-Western cultures, which are defined largely by the absence of a concept of big N nature. But at the same time, the very strangeness of ancient sympathy is a reminder that there isn't a continuous line from antiquity to the present moment. One reason, then, that sympathy is such a powerful idea now is precisely its doubleness, its complicity with Western notions of nature and organicism, but also its utter unfamiliarity. In light of its doubleness, we could understand an inquiry into sympatheia as the call to an ecology that is, as Nietzsche might say, untimely. So my work today is a small part of this larger inquiry. So I just spoke of the doubleness of sympathy in terms of it being poised between familiarity and strangeness. But sympathy is double, too, as an impetus to think in two ways at once. So in the domain of sympathy, we find together an often pious commitment to the unity, the completeness, and the perfection of the world. And at the same time, we find a tarrying with its parts and its particulars. Whether observing symbiotic plants or tidal patterns, magnetic attraction, or a mother's milk coming in, ancient authors don't just see two bodies in relation to one another. They see, too, a principle of connectivity as a feature of the world, indeed as its defining feature. At the same time, sympathy leads the other direction from abstract concepts of wholeness to the particular waxing and waning of a mouse's liver or the bloom of pennyroyal. So in sympathy, we scale up and down in the same breath. We travel horizontally across a plane of beings all participating in the life of the cosmos, but also we travel vertically from a master order imposed on the many parts. So nowhere is this clearer than in the cosmic sympathy of the Stoics. I therefore want to spend the rest of my time today animating the different vectors of Stoic sympathy. So the Stoics will necessarily loom large in any history of sympathy, and sympathy in turn seems to have been at the heart of Stoic physics. Now, the evidence for the Stoics is, of course, late and lacunos. This makes it risky to try to reconstruct sympathy as the doctrine of any one thinker. What's more important, I think, to recognize is that the evidence that we do have suggests that the Stoics were keen to see and to show sympathy around them as manifest proof of their cosmological and metaphysical claims. So one of the best places to observe this deictic mode is Cicero's On the Nature of the Gods. In the course of a series of arguments about the nature of God, the Stoic mouthpiece, Balbus, deploys sympathy as decisive evidence of his school's theology and cosmology. So who will not be compelled, he says, by the sympathetic agreement, interconnection, and affinity of all things? He goes on to list the seasons, the lunar influence on the tides, and the courses of the stars, all of which ostensibly prove the presence of a single divine, all-pervading breath, a spiritus. Similarly, in his On Divination, Cicero, playing the skeptic, says that the Stoics have collected much evidence in order to prove that there's some kind of natural connection, a cognatio naturalis, in the nature of things. Oysters and shellfish that wax with the moon, flowers that bloom at the arrival of the winter solstice, trees whose sap lessen in winter. The Stoic attention to these facts is confirmed by Sextus Empiricus. He starts by pointing to the coordination between the phases of the moon and the waxing and waning of animals on land and sea, the tides and the large-scale effects of climactic change, and he then paraphrases the climax of the Stoic argument. And from these facts, it is obvious, sum fanes, that the universe or the cosmos is a unified body. Now, there are a couple of things to note about these passages. First, in the passages from On the Nature of the Gods and Sextus, sympathy is a fact that can compel belief in something else. So a single all-pervading breath and the status of the cosmos as a unified body, respectively. It is, in other words, the springboard to inferences about the nature of the world. So what exactly is being taken as given here? It isn't the tide or the bloom of particular flowers. It's not the natural bodies or the events that these becomings are put in touch with, the moon or the winter solstice. Rather, it is the relation itself that's being posited as an observed and an irrefutable fact. And interestingly, that fact wasn't necessarily contested by the Stoics' critics. So although Cicero will deny Stoic arguments about divination, he easily concedes that there must be some kind of connection in the nature of things. The academic critic in On the Nature of Gods, Cotta, also allows that the Stoic collection of facts requires an explanation, but he chalks the phenomena in question up to largely spontaneous forces in nature, naturae viribus. To the extent that the Stoics succeed in making those around them see the cosmos in terms of sympathy, the battle shifts away from the surface of sympathy to the hidden powers that cause it. So let's take a closer look at what what sympathy makes visible in the Stoics. So I'll begin with what the Stoics themselves say before turning to a knot of ideas that cluster around the figure of the organic body. So I want to see what the Stoics say they think they're seeing, and then I want to think about what I think the Stoics are seeing even when they don't say they're seeing that. So we can start with Sextus's claim that sympathy proves the cosmos is a unified body. So the expression that he uses here, henomenon ti soma, is a technical term. So the Stoics, Sextus tells us, differentiated between three types of bodies. The simplest of these are flocks, choruses, and armies. In other words, loose groupings that are composed of separate elements. The next category includes bodies whose elements are joined together, like ships, for example, or cables, or turrets. Now, in both of these cases, the parts can survive the destruction of the whole. For these bodies do not, by definition, sustain sympathy between their parts. For example, even if an entire army perishes except for one soldier, that lone survivor doesn't suffer anything by transmission, katadiadosin. By contrast, if a finger is cut, the entire body shares in its pain. That's because organic bodies, unlike armies and unlike ships, are unified phenomena. The parts all depend on the larger whole. In light of its sympathies, the cosmos, too, the Stoics conclude, must be a unified body. So what gives a unified body its defining cohesion? Here we can go back to Bulbus's claim that the remarkable co-feeling, co-breathing, continuous affinity of all things bears witness to the presence of an all-pervading breath, spiritus, which translates the Greek word pneuma. In Alexander of Aphrodisias's paraphrase of Chrysippus, the whole of substance is unified, henosthai, because it is totally pervaded by a pneuma through which the whole is held together, is stable, and is sympathetic with itself. But then we can ask, what is it about pneuma that gives it the power to endow a unified body, whether a microcosmic part or the cosmic whole, with cohesion? The answer has much to do with the tension or the tensional power of pneuma, what the Stoics call its tonos. Tonos is a fundamentally dynamic notion arising from the twofold nature of pneuma as air and fire. So the cold air contracts inward, the hot fire expands outward. Now, it's easiest to understand these tensional breaths by taking a look at their consequences for individual microcosmic bodies. That's because one of the most important things about tonos is that it varies from body to body depending on the proportion of qualities, hot, cold, wet, and dry. And these tensional variations account for the particular qualities of a body, so the hardness of a diamond, for example, or the sheen of silver. They also create subclasses of unified bodies. And like the three classes of bodies, these subclasses are ranked in an ascending order according to the complexity of the structure that's created by pneuma. The lowest rung is occupied by rocks, and here pneuma creates a cohesion called hexis, which is sometimes translated as tenor. In plants, it creates physis, or nature. In animals, it creates psyche, soul. In mature human beings, the psyche acquires the capacity for reason through a further refinement of pneuma. And finally, in gods and sages, and importantly, in the cosmos as a whole, pneuma enables perfect reason. So with these examples in front of us, we can see why structure is a more revealing term than just cohesion. Pneuma does not just hold a body together. Rather, it creates a single state in which every part is bound up with every other part and the whole. So as Cato puts it in Cicero's On Ends for the Stoics, all of nature is so tightly interconnected that if you alter a single letter, you disrupt the whole, or quite literally, the whole collapses. These are the conditions that entail sympathy. And these conditions then point to the power of pneuma to create wholes that are greater than the sum of their parts. That power points to the high ontological status of pneuma in the Stoic system, despite the fact it's technically a compound of elements and so ontologically derivative. And indeed, at least from Chrysippus onward, pneuma functions as the corporeal vehicle for one of the two fundamental metaphysical principles in Stoicism. So for the active principle, which is sometimes called God or reason or fate, which is opposed to the passive principle that is matter. The qualities of pneuma differ as it passes through different kinds of unified bodies, so worms and stars, oysters and toddlers. Yet at the same time as the pneuma of the cosmic animal, it recuperates these different bodies into a single whole. The work of pneuma then creates inwardly cohesive bodies, but it also opens them up to other bodies and to the enveloping macrocosm. By bearing witness to sympathy on a grand scale, the Stoics enlist it as proof of the life of the cosmos. But now I use this word life advisedly, for it's worth emphasizing that in the proofs from sympathy that we saw earlier, life is actually not at stake. The presence of sympathy will prove that a body is cohesive. It will prove the all-pervading presence of pneuma, but it does not actually prove more than that. Neither reason nor life is a necessary property of the unified body. Or to put it another way, cohesion is both necessary and sufficient for sympathy. Sympathy is exhibited as much by lifeless bodies as by living ones, by stones as much as by sages, unless you think this is to impose a kind of taxonomy on the Stoics. They do distinguish between living and non-living bodies. Stones are not alive. Indeed, the Stoics don't try to claim otherwise, though. They lean on sympathy, not on sympathy, but on a battery of syllogisms which are credited to Zeno to support their claim that cosmos is animate, sentient, and intelligent. So one of Zeno's favorites, we're told by Cicero, goes something like this: if flutes that played tunes grew on an olive tree, you would not question that the olive tree had some knowledge of flute playing. Why then would anyone question that the world is animate and wise when it produces offspring that are animate and wise? Now, these arguments were not watertight, they were not always original, they did not go unchallenged, but you can't blame the Stoics for not backing up the claims that they make about the nature of the cosmos. Nevertheless, the belief that the cosmos is an intelligent animal no doubt ranks high among what Michael White calls the prior commitments of Stoic physics. These commitments themselves had antecedents. The pre-Socratics more often than not seem to have seen the world as divine. But the real watershed moment, of course, comes with Plato's Timaeus, where the cosmos is expressly envisioned as an animal, alive, sentient, intelligent, and the influence of that dialogue in the Stoics is widely accepted. Yet biology only goes so deep in the Timaeus where craft analogies predominate. For the elaboration of biological models, the Stoics had Aristotle, as we've already seen amply on this panel. For Aristotle, though, biology is worked out at the level of the individual organism for the most part. It was left to the Stoics then to embrace biological life on a cosmic scale explicitly, and in so doing, they develop what David Hom felicitously called cosmobiology. Now, I want to suggest that the Stoic commitment to radical cosmobiology is necessary to understanding the work that sympathy does in Stoic physics and metaphysics, as well as the tensions that it creates. More specifically, sympathy indirectly, but nevertheless suggestively supports the Stoic arguments that the cosmos isn't just a cohesive body, but something more, something alive, something sentient, something intelligent. Indirectly, because as we've just seen, sympathy cannot in itself prove the presence of these properties. But suggestively, because there's evidence that the organic body is, from an early point, a privileged site for the expression of sympathy, not only between different parts, but between the parts in a whole. So the argument that the affections of the smallest parts affect the whole body is already found in the 5th century medical text on places in a human being. And there's also evidence that the concept of sympathy was gaining traction in the 4th century as a way of describing the relationship between soul and body as separate but mutually affected parts of the human organism. And the organic body is a crucial locus of sympathy for the Stoics themselves. So recall the passage that we saw earlier from Sextus, where he recounts a common Stoic argument. In marshalling evidence for the claim that unified bodies exhibit sympathy, Sextus gives an example. If the finger is cut, the whole body suffers. So here the Stoics use the human body in order to prove that sympathy is the sign of a unified body. And for the argument to work, the unity of the human body has to be presumed. That we feel pain when the finger is cut secures the claim that sympathy is a property of unified body. After the dependence of sympathy on cohesion is established through the microcosm, Sextus can return to the claim that the cosmos is a unified body because it exhibits sympathy. And the sympathy between body and soul was also taken as a given by the Stoics. So here, for example, is their argument for the corporeality of the soul. No incorporeal suffers together with a body, and no body with an incorporeal, but the soul suffers together with the body when it is sick and being cut, and the body with the soul. Thus, when the soul feels shame and fear, the body turns red and pale, respectively. Therefore, the soul is a body. So my point is that there's a givenness to sympathy in the organic body, both inside and outside Stoicism, that supports its visibility at the macrocosmic level. The privileged place of the organic body in arguments from sympathy suggests that when sympathy travels from the microcosm to the macrocosm, it trails with it a knot of ideas about ensouled and embodied life. It would appear then that for the Stoics, sympathy is a deeply organic concept. Then again, you might say, what else would you expect from a school of radical cosmobiologists? And indeed, the sympathy of the Stoics is often approached from this point of unsurprise. I want to see the organicism trailed by sympathy rather as an invitation to think about sympathy as a mode through which Stoic natural philosophy and a philosophy of nature, after Aristotle more generally, is haunted by the complexities of organicism on a micro and a macro scale. So I'm going to start to unpack this claim by arguing that sympathy resonates differently depending on whether you approach it through the lens of the active principle or the lens of the passive principle. Put another way, sympathy exaggerates the nature of cohesive bodies and the cosmos itself as body and mind, matter and God, receptivity and top-down order. And at the same time, sympathy carves out a conceptual space to hold together aspects of an organic body together in dynamic tension. In short, sympathy signals the openness and the affectability of living beings, as well as their inner determination, their closedness around a proper end. So let's start with the notions of openness and affectability. So think for a moment about what sympatheia is not. In earlier texts, unity on a grand scale is often cast in terms of symphonia or harmonia, words that probably had associations with Pythagoreanism. When classical writers talk about symphonia, they imply that two or more things are in agreement with one another in a way that's like the concord produced by a harmony of two or more musical notes. Plato, for example, talks about the symphonia of the parts of the soul, which can be brought into accord by certain kinds of music or by stargazing. Now, if music or astronomy is efficacious here, it's because the soul has a share of a mathematicized reality. For Plato, as well as for the Pythagoreans, the more ideal the object, the less entangled in matter, and so the purer its harmonies. Participation is located at what we might call the highest common denominator. By contrast, the common ground of bodies that are connected through sympathy lies in their ability to be affected, to undergo pathe. The fact that affectability is the property in play here is not surprising, given the Stoic definition of body in terms of that which affects and is affected by. Now, in theory, pathos is a neutral idea. But of course, pathos is not a neutral word. In the early medical writers, it almost always points to a damaged condition. And the idea of pathos qua sensation or emotion was a negatively charged one in the ethical tradition, and nowhere more so than in the Stoics, who prized above all a state of apatheia. This negative valence of pathos bleeds through some of what seem to have been paradigmatic examples of sympathy for the Stoics. In the example from Nemesius, sympathy occurs in the body that falls ill or gets cut, or the soul that's ashamed or afraid. In the passage from Sextus, sympathy is made manifest when the finger is cut. Pain is again central to an analogy from Heraclitus that the Stoics appropriated to talk about the soul's permeation of the body. So in Heraclitus, the soul hurries toward a wound like a spider sensing a tear in its web and scurrying towards the site of damage. In the version ascribed to Chrysippus, the soul doesn't travel, but perceives an impact to the flesh through the top medium of pneuma. Still, the image of damage here remains. I want to suggest then that one of the consequences of making the organic body so central to the trope of sympathy is that the Stoics elicit, whether deliberately or unconsciously, a sense of pathos as a sense of as a sign of vulnerability. Moreover, the attention to each part as a portal to the whole distributes vulnerability throughout the entire organism. The interlocking of the parts means the susceptibility of any part to being affected puts the entire organism at risk. This distributed vulnerability is, of course, one of the consequences of making affectability the ground of community, namely that parts are not just subordinated to the ends of the whole, but acquire a power over its integrity. Now, everything that I've just said makes much sense for the microcosm, but things will get complicated when we pass to the macro level of the cosmos for at least two reasons. First, unlike bodies that are buoyed in a flux of matter, the cosmos, like the cosmic animal in the Timaeus, is fully self-sufficient. So what happens to the cosmos doesn't open it up to an outside, but is already internal to it. The world doesn't impinge on the cosmic organism, but is contained by it. And second, when the finger is cut, damage ripples from part to whole. By contrast, if we go back to the examples we started with, we can see that the focus isn't really on how the suffering of one part is communicated to the whole. Instead, it's on an all-pervasive force that acts on different parts of the whole in a coordinated way. So rather than the flesh sending its pain to the soul, the flesh of the world receives the ripples of pneumatic causality. Indeed, some of the paradigmatic images of cosmic sympathy, so flowering trees or tidal flows, don't suggest a world in pain at all. They suggest a world that is dynamic and alive, a world permeated by a quivering sensibility. But then again, these two ideas, vulnerability and vitality, are not unrelated. When the Stoics see sympathy, they see in one sense the vulnerability of the interconnected body, a risky openness to the world that's magnified by the communicability of affection within a cohesive body. But they also see sympathy as a body's pulsing connection to the rhythms of other bodies due to the common receptivity to a vital force. On both counts, sympathy exaggerates the passive principle as the openness to being affected. Being alive and being damaged are two sides of the same coin, namely being in an organic body. The riskiness of life is the condition of dynamic becoming. And yet again, we're still here at the level of the individual organism. So what are the implications, if any, for the sympathetic cosmos? The first thing to say is that the very pulsation of sympathy on a grand scale reveals the limitation of drawing too sharp a line between the microcosm and the macrocosm. For the full sense of an organism's life only comes into view in the Stoics once it's embedded in a larger sympathetic web. And I think this is an important difference between Aristotle's notion of a nature and the Stoic emphasis on individual beings as embedded within a larger matrix. So Cleomedes, for example, will say the fact that all individuals are in relation to others is a proof that nature controls the cosmos. For the Stoics then, sympathy is both what connects the parts of an organic body and what connects that body to other bodies within the cosmos. And what this means is that macrocosmic sympathy has to be understood not just as a form of analogical extension where the organism becomes the cosmos. It's also crucially a form of enmeshment where the boundaries of the organism are being renegotiated. The sympathetic cosmos involves the openness of part wholes to the larger whole, as well as to one another. And there is, in fact, a stronger claim to be made here. It's frankly hard to imagine an organism that's completely self-sufficient. Plato's heroic attempt in the Timaeus, where the cosmic animal eats its own waste, performs the difficulties. What this means in the Stoic context, I'd suggest, is that the enmeshed parts of the cosmos become powerfully metonymic. If the coordinated life cycles of the moon and flowers and shellfish point to sympathy within the cosmic whole, they also persuasively enact a richer notion of sympathy as evidence of openness as well as cohesion. And it's worth stressing again that an enriched notion of sympathy belongs to the most humble natures precisely because it privileges affectability. And so the life of the worm both is and is not the life of the cosmos. Now, I've been arguing that sympathy, as the word itself suggests, draws out the implications of mattering, of being in matter for organic beings and for the cosmos as a whole. But what about the other side of organic life, what I described above as its inwardness, its closedness? And here we have to go back to the principle of cohesion. So earlier we saw how an all-pervading pneuma guarantees the cohesion of unified bodies, expressing that cohesion differentially in stones and plants and animals and humans. In each case, the integrity of the whole is secured by the coherence of the organism, a sympathy between parts within. That is, enmeshment isn't only a condition of vulnerability. It also enlists the parts in the dynamic work of the whole understood, at least in an organic body, as a specific form of life. From this angle, sympathy expresses the coordination of parts under the directive power of pneuma qua active principle, or more accurately, under the direction of God or nature. It points, in short, to a top-down system. And this system is, of course, most top-down when we zoom out to consider the sympathetic cosmos as a whole. The question that arises when you start thinking about the entire cosmos as an organism is, what is its nature? What are its ends? And from this angle, the parts, that is, individual organisms, get sucked into the life of the whole, into a master plan. And in fact, the Stoics were very big on master plans. For one thing, they were strongly committed to the view that lower order bodies exist for the sake of higher order ones. So from one angle, the worm is on equal footing with the president. From another, the Stoic cosmos is a rigid scala naturae. Pneuma pervades the entire world, but it distributes mind and reason unevenly, thereby producing natural relationships of subordination. Chrysippus famously said that the pig exists to keep bacon fresh for us. And we are ourselves no more than parts of the whole. Our lives are part of its life. We've seen the integration of parts into the whole just now in terms of natural cycles. But the turn to the human part is a good occasion to stress that the Stoics were enthusiastic and totalizing determinists, committed to the idea of fate as one big web, sumploque, of causes. The discussion of sympathy in Cicero's On Divination comes up in just this context. So Cicero says he's perfectly willing to accept what he calls some kind of cognatio or kinship within the nature of things. But he's going to draw the line at the kinds of connections between things that divination presumes. So what's the connection, he asks, between the cleft in a liver and my lucky windfall? One obeys the laws of nature, the other the laws of human lives. But of course, for the Stoics, this division into natural laws and human ones is entirely illegitimate. The animal liver and the lottery winner are in sympathy as much as the moon and the oyster are. And against the protest that God doesn't concern himself with such minutiae, the Stoics argued that the entire cosmos was structured at the moment of creation so that certain causes precede others, even at vast removes of space. So there's no God here that's intervening in the particulars. Rather, the life of the cosmos in its totality is programmed at the moment that God generates it out of fire. We cross from natural cyclicity here to the order of the event. Here is sympathy at its most closed and even claustrophobic, signaling the incorporation of every last particular into the perfect, predetermined unfolding of cosmic life. Every found wallet, every worm's wiggle, every cut finger is sucked into the whole. So we've begun to get a sense of what sympathy invites us to see in the world, not just pneuma or cohesion, but the complexity of the organism as both matter and mind. I've described these facets of sympathy in terms of openness and closedness, affectability and top-down organization. Sympathy is about the cut to the flesh and the ebb and flow of life within a diverse community of bodies. It's also about the ordering of life in a world not just tightly interwoven, but constrained by a predetermined plan. By traversing this ground, we've started to map what I've been calling the dynamism of sympathy. And I've also tried to start mapping another dynamic between the most micro level of the microcosmic and the most macro level of the macrocosmic. In the domain of sympathy, we find, as I said earlier, a tarrying with parts and particulars, an attention to frogs and sea urchins and worms that's lacking in the metaphysics of Plato, and even, I would argue, in Aristotle. At the same time, by embedding organisms within larger webs of relation, sympathy points to the pervasive mind of God or nature. And this dynamic that I've just described now also entails attention. There is, as we've seen, an asymmetry between the cosmos as an organism and the natures it encompasses. The many cohesive bodies populating the cosmos have the status of both parts and wholes. They're parts in the context of the larger cosmic whole, and yet they're wholes in their own right, complete with internal sympathies and relationships to other wholes that are necessary for life. So through sympathy, we start to see not only some of the tensions of the organism, but tensions within a community of organisms when that community is figured as an organism itself. So in the Stoics, sympathy is avowedly top-down, allied with the most determinist physics produced by ancient Greco-Roman philosophy. But we cannot just redeem sympathy if what we're even interested in is redemption by collapsing this vertical axis into the horizontal. The challenge rather here, I think, is to think life not just as vulnerable and open, but also as telic and organized, as mindful in its own way. It's to take on board the ideal of arete, or the ideal of flourishing from ancient philosophy, not as given or not as prescriptive and not as pious, but as the call to rethink modes of mindfulness and reflexivity and care that persist despite fragmentation, or we might say that thrive in contingency and that are lived through relation. It's about locating these modes on a continuum with other forms of life, from protozoa to pennyroyal, without betraying a politics of difference, not just sexual difference, but non-human difference as well. In its strangeness, even exoticism, sympathy is not the secret path to the ends, or the question of ends, but it might be a place to think anew about the end, the idea of the end as paradoxically open-ended, and about the organism as contained, but paradoxically created through relation. Thank you.
You started off with these two models of thinking about what I was thinking in connection with what Julia was saying yesterday in terms of biopolitics, a kind of, utopian biopolitics on the one hand and a dystopian one on the other in terms of connectedness, and then you moved on to thinking about how your project is sort of genealogically, a form of genealogy of that. And I mean, it seemed to me that the way in which you articulated our relationship to this material as being, on the one hand, an ecology of others, right? Something which is different and therefore independent, and therefore a possible resource for thinking otherwise. But on the other hand, something that we're determined to repeat in some form or other because we're part of a similar program. There seemed to be a kind of mapping of that back onto the Stoic material, the form of kind of predetermined plan on the one hand, or versus a possibility of a more kind of open-ended. So there seemed to be a kind of mapping of the frame onto the content in a particular way. And I suppose what I'm trying to say is, what kind of genealogy are you trying to produce, which is what you sort of came to at the end. But is it precisely trying to work through our relationship to this material in terms of some of the contradictions and possibilities that are opened up by Stoicism?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I'm still thinking this aspect of the paper through myself, but I mean, well, two thoughts. I mean, one, when I said at the beginning, I mean, this is part of a kind of larger conversation about the relationship between sympathy and questions of nature. I am interested in sort of teasing out the double-sidedness that's inherent in a kind of notion of big N nature as a kind of organicist nature from the beginning, in order to sort of see what comes with this idea of ecology per se, as the question of relatedness and connectivity and the kind of world breathing together that we want to use to think through the kind of predicament that we're in now, or the question of connectivity we're in now. And it's, there's a kind of repetition of the projection of big N nature, not quite in the sense that I think Emma's describing it, but similarly, kind of notion of an organism that can also have kind of demiurgic properties, but really it's a question of the organism. To what extent that gets produced the moment that you want to think the relation between beings, for example. And so, for example, if you look at, kind of founding text of posthumanism, Jakob van Uxkel's work on the foray into the world of humans and animals, I mean, you see a very, this interest in kind of perceptual life worlds and the kind of fittedness of the most, the smallest beings into one another's lives. And yet, how do you account for the kind of mindfulness of the relation? The mindfulness of the relation sort of pushes you up to this big N nature, this idea that the parts have to be recuperated into a whole. And so there's a kind of complicity between a really productive way of thinking of affectability and interrelation that goes across a continuum, and on the other hand, a confusion about what kind of mindfulness makes that possible and what kind of transcendence has to be imagined in order to kind of account for the kind of immanence of mind in these, ostensibly mindless beings. And I think it goes to what, when we were, again, Emma, to go back to your question, why does this demiurgic thing come out in Aristotle? Why is there kind of this recurrence to that? And it's a challenge of thinking mind in any kind of, non-anthropic sense, that the models that we have of mind tend to look like our minds. And I mean, a lot of the work on plant life now, I think, is a place to challenge that. But so it's that complicity that I'm interested in sort of mapping with a concept that might, and I think it has been taken up, it's starting to be taken up by some people as merely a positive notion. Sympathy, ancient sympatheia, communities of human and non-human, isn't this a great idea? And actually, if we sort of excavate genealogically, we see the things that come with that. And then the second thing I'll say just more quickly, there is also the dominance of kind of organismic thinking or vitalistic thinking as we try to imagine political life, and I think that comes out, as we, in the conversation about Zoe and Bios, and there are many productive things to be had from that kind of vocabulary being applied to political life, but I think it becomes especially important as people want to think the life of the community to expand to the non-human as well. And there's a kind of shallow conversation, I feel like, around the question of vitalism. So if you look at, say, the beginning of Rosie Bradati's essay in the New Materialisms volume that came out a few years ago, she says, look, I'm not going to talk about neo-vitalist politics because that's implicated in 30s, it's implicated in 30s Germany and organicism, and we know where that ends up, and so we can't go there. Its political, telos, as it were, is given, and totalitarianism and fascist. And rather than just say, it's one or the other, it's Jane Bennett or it's Rosie Bradati's image of a kind of fascist Germany, that both of those are enfolded within organistic thinking, but it doesn't mean that we don't discard it, that we just say we embrace or we discard it, that in fact the polarization of those two positions in a kind of contemporary, thinking about life and politics in life, to my mind is sort of, is a dead end, that actually we need to get to a level where we can think the complexity of organicism together, because we're not, life is the question of the 21st century. Nature is still the question of the 21st century. It just is. It's become part of our conceptual vocabulary. And I almost don't think that we can opt out at this point. And so to understand what the vectors are inherent in that, and how they are sort of embedded from a very early point in the tradition that is nevertheless strange to us, is the heart of what I'm sort of calling this untimely ecology.